first about his business background, and then Professor Pickerel is going to provide commentary, relevant interjections when it's warranted, and just try and stimulate the conversation and as far as involving the audience as well. If you have any questions at any time, even if it's during the presentation, raise your hand, and once you're recognized by one of the speakers or myself, then feel free to ask your question. And we are going to have a hard break at 12:50, so if you have class, please just wait until that point. Don't worry, we'll stop right on time so that you can get out and get to class on time. I would also like to thank the board. You guys have been amazing in getting everything together for this event and just overall, and especially the 1Ls who are sort of on a tryout basis for cabinet positions. And I'd like to right now just offer those appointments, and these people can speak with me after and let me know if they accept them. But the following appointments for the 1Ls would be the College of Law Outreach Chair, Austin Davies, Director of Marketing, Todd McPencow, Technical Coordinator, Lucas Park, University Outreach Chair, Danny Mark, and Associate Policy Analyst, Brian Cunningham. I'd also like to introduce the existing board. My name is Sarah Walsh, I'm the president. Our vice president is Sam Perkins, and I think he's at an RA meeting. Our secretary, Alexis Aranda. Treasurer, Ryan Reese. Reception coordinator, Justina Skinner. Sergeant at Arms, Nick Perrone. Policy analyst, Dan Knudsen. And we have 3L advisors. Let's see who's here. I know Samantha Brown's here. Isioma Ebringa. And is Jeremy here? Okay, well, Jeremy as well. And I think I've done enough talking about that. Just real quickly, I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'm going to be very brief because they'll cover some of their background as well. I'm going to start with Professor Mitch Pickerel. He's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science right here at NIU. He has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, a JD from Indiana University, and a BA from Purdue University. Some of his topics of teaching and research are American politics, law and courts, constitutional law and theory, and federalism. And Sean O'Hare is our national speaker, coming from the East Coast. He's launched several successful companies, which he'll tell you about. He's a seasoned entrepreneur, investment banker, and advisor to nonprofits. Entrepreneurship is the only job description he's ever had, and at age 18, he launched his first business, for which he received the 2003 East Coast Collegiate Entrepreneur of the Year Award. He's going to go into all of his experience in the time that we have, and further enlighten us. But before he does that, I would like to introduce Professor Mitch Pickerel. Just let him tell us if there's anything that I didn't get from your biography that you'd like to cover before we get started. So, have a way, guys.
Mitch Pickerel, Political Science Department. This is my third year at NIU. I taught at Washington State University for 11 years. I actually did practice law. My practice was corporate law, commercial transactions, and government contract law for the most part, but that was a long time ago. And so while I worked with people like Mr. O'Hare, it was a while ago. Most of my interests now are constitutional theory, federalism, some law and policy. And so since this isn't really going to be a straightforward debate, I hope that my role here can be to kind of help you draw some connections between your interest in law and obviously eventually practicing law and the types of deals and entrepreneurship and venture capital that Sean's going to talk about. So I'll do my best. I'll just add that when I offer graduate seminars, if they're appropriate, they are cross-listed they're cross-listed with law origin. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to your main event.
All right. There may or not be a presentation coming up in a little bit, just to kind of walk you through a deal that I'm working on currently, just to give you some practical implications. But either way, we can certainly talk without the aid of the presentation. So, as was mentioned, I'm a kind of lifelong entrepreneur, so to speak, starting my first company at 18 and now doing investment banking. I like to say that it's gone from painting to private equity. My first business was house painting. So at 18 years old, there's not a lot of businesses you can start. Well, nowadays you can start the next Facebook, I guess, but it wasn't the case necessarily for me at the time. And house painting was really the only game in town. And I, took my life savings. I bought a paint trailer. I attached it to the back of my 1993 Ford Probe, which is not meant to tow things, but it does look sweet with tinted windows and I'm sure a sweet system that I had. And it was my first experience in risk. And I think that's one of the things that I like to talk about with law schools that I've come to visit, which this is probably my 10th or 15th or somewhere in that range. I've got 3 next week. I'm like, I feel like one of those, not nearly as cool, but like a rock star was like, hey, I love you. Wait, what's the name again? You have to look at the back of your guitar to figure out what's accurate. So risk is really what all of this comes down to, and risk tolerance. And I think a lot of times we get too caught up in these kind of fine lines between, attorneys look at things this way, business people look at things that way, and so on and so forth. The reality is that business always involves risk. At some point, something has to be offered up in exchange for a future return, an uncertain future return. I've launched probably, 6 or 7 businesses now. Half have succeeded, half have failed. And that's a good percentage. 90% of businesses fail in their first 2 years. That's a daunting statistic. And you know that going in. Now, of course, the more times you do it, the better you get at it. So failure is actually an important part of the process. And where does the law come into play? Well, one of my most recent companies that led to this transaction that I've been working on started with my running a construction company for about 7 years, and then it led to me running a smart home technology company. And I had some engineers working for me, and then the market crashed, the real estate market. We were working with houses between $5 and $15 million that were all new construction, right? So guess what isn't going to happen in a market where we can't get construction loans and you can't get mortgages anymore? When multimillionaires run out of money to finish their multi-million-dollar houses, that's bad. So I turned to my engineers and I said, well, we're not in the smart home technology business anymore. What business are we? And he said, well, we like energy management, we like energy efficiency, we like lighting, we want to get into LED. And I said, that's great. I said, what the hell's an LED? This is like 2008, I guess. Light emitting diode, for those that don't know. So I studied it, and that was my first opportunity to try to raise capital outside of my own resources. And by that point, I had already had 3 or 4 companies. We probably owned, about $3 or $4 million in real estate for our real estate side, and I still own some restaurants and things like that. But this is the first time I went out looking for capital elsewhere. And then you really get introduced to what the marketplace does to try to facilitate transactions. What are all the different kind of parties in play, and what are their incentives, and how do you try to get and satisfy all parties to make sure that you're creating a product or a service that the market actually wants, right? Everything to that point had been local. A local construction company, a local painting company, a local smart home technology company, local restaurants. It's very easy to more or less understand who the buyer is, who the consumer is, where the marketplace is. But as you enter into raising capital from institutionals and banks and so forth, they're going to have a much more global focus. And I'm just a dumb entrepreneur. I don't come from a finance background. I didn't get an MBA. I don't have a corporate background. I started my first company and I just kept going. I had to get into college with a soccer scholarship. I was not getting in on my grades. And so the good part about that is I didn't really know what I should have been afraid of. So I just kept trying stuff. And eventually I realized I needed guys who could structure and really see the big picture. And that's where my most recent business partner came into play. He has much more of a similar background to you all. JD from UVA, was at a white shoe law firm in New York City at Cadwalader, Wickersham, and Taft. And when I say Taft, I mean Howard Taft, as in that's how old this law firm was. And he was an entrepreneur at heart. And what makes a guy like that decide to leave after he'd survived all the layoffs that had happened right after the mortgage crisis to jump on board with me to start an energy efficiency lighting company, to sell light bulbs, essentially, well, light fixtures. But you know, his fellow associates thought he was a little crazy. You know, you're giving up a $200,000-$300,000 job for what? To sell light fixtures? Are you sure it's going to work? Well, of course not. Well, but you already got 4 or 5 years into this. You know, you could get a partner, you could do that, or whatever else. But he was an entrepreneur, had been before he went to law school. And so where does the element of risk come into play? Well, of course, there's the risk for your investors. There's the risk for your employees that you can keep them employed. But for Chris, it got very personal. And he, at that time, I had 3 or 4 kids. And when you're talking about starting a business and leaving a stable job, these things don't happen without a conversation with your wife. And what he decided was, what's the worst thing that can possibly happen here, right? Because you got to look at worst case scenario if you want to get into something. I've never done that, and this is one of the things that Chris did and attorneys do in general, which is a valuable skill set to analyze where this could go all the way wrong and all the way right, hopefully. And so he said to his wife, all right, the worst thing that happens is we go bankrupt. Business doesn't work out. We need to declare bankruptcy. We probably lose this house. And we got to rent for like the next 5 or 10 years. But I can always go back and get a job at a law firm. That's the worst thing that can happen. And once they both got comfortable with that, then we were able to launch the company. So the importance of bankruptcy law, the importance of bankruptcy as a part of kind of American capitalism is incredibly valuable. It's not something you think of as a necessary tool. But I know that guys like Henry Ford declared bankruptcy, or did declare bankruptcy, and then went on to great successes. It helps us understand that that element of the law incentivizes those like myself to take risks, knowing that our economy is willing to absorb that and our system is willing to absorb that. So off we went, we started this company, and we started developing relationships with a couple manufacturers to distribute their lighting fixtures. And long story short, we started working with some private manufacturers. We got to know them pretty well. And I think we did about $1.5 million in our first year in sales, and then we were trending a little bit better. But when we were going to these private manufacturers, Chris said, what's interesting, like, these companies are all about 30, 40 years old. They all got started when fluorescent lighting was first more or less invented and kind of became mainstream. So they kind of reached their maturation point, just like we do in our own lives. The business had reached its maturation point until maybe somebody else could come in and take it to the next level. And he said, I know we're talking about forming partnerships with these guys and distributing their products, but I think we could buy them. I had a painting company like 7 years earlier. I said, are we allowed to do that? Is that actually something we could pull off? Now, obviously, his Wall Street background taught him that the systems that we have in terms of access to capital and private equity firms and investment banks and VCs willing to take risk told him that yes, if we could pair a unique opportunity with an established business and show where we can add value, there's going to be people that are going to want to participate in it. So we started shopping for capital. So how do you do that? We looked at the whole marketplace. We had about 8 target companies, and we wanted to buy somewhere between 3 to 4 of them, maybe more, depending on the deals. So to give you a sense of the scale, we're talking the smallest companies were doing about 10 to 12 million in revenue, and the biggest companies were doing between 70 and 80 million dollars in revenue. So how do you go around? Because I don't have $100 million to buy these companies. But the institutional buyers do, and in this case, private equity firms. So we went around shopping for private equity. And so what we did is we put together our pitch, which is the presentation you would see, but I'm just way more engaging. So it must be really weird when you're giving presentations here and everyone's looking over here instead of at you, and that's actually a good thing. I actually gave a speech the other day, and they have, they have like the camera on you the whole time, but it's like live feed on either side, and so people are going like this, and I'm like, wait, I couldn't tell if they're actually into it or not. They didn't know eye contact. It's terrible. The fact that none of you, only like, I only see a handful of laptops, and I'll take that as a compliment. So we went around saying, here's what we're looking at, and what we do is we paint the larger picture, right? So we're talking about the global. We start with the biggest, and I do this with guys who try to give sales presentations. I always say, start the broadest sense, see if they get it, and then go to the next one. Get a little bit more defined, and a little bit more defined until you're on the same page. So we start with, there's an energy crisis, right? There's not enough energy, and you owned 2 devices 10 years ago, now you own 30, right? And we consume more energy, there's more things we can use for it, and there's limited capacity. So therefore, energy efficiency is a good thing. Okay. Well then, why lighting? Well, lighting can be up to 70% of a commercial enterprise's energy bill. Oh, really? Yeah, well, you don't think about warehouses and logistics and distribution centers that all they do is use lighting. They don't heat and cool place. They're just moving dry goods and things that don't require insulation and such. All right, so there's a lot of money being spent, in lighting. All right, then why these fixtures? Well, they're really energy efficient. We take out 480 watt fixtures and we replace them with 220 watt fixtures, and they get twice the amount of light. Okay, half the energy, twice the light. Okay, I get it. Why these companies? Well, we've identified that these companies, if put together in a merger, could eventually add enough value to the marketplace where they can be sold a couple years down the line. All right, well, who are you going to sell to? We define the exit, which is there are in the industry, in the US-based lighting fixture manufacturer space. I know, really sexy. Try not to get too excited. There are about 400 companies. You ever think about that? 400 companies in the United States that manufacture light fixtures. You thought there was like 10, maybe, right? Or that's all overseas now. There's a lot of US-based companies. So 4 of them are over $1 billion. Hubble, these really big companies. There's 1 between 150 million and $1 billion, and then the rest are all below 100 million. So what the marketplace had told us is that if you could merge, you could acquire and then merge a couple of companies together and create efficiencies and get it over 100 or 150 million dollars, one of the big 4 would buy you because they were just looking for market share. And that seems almost crazy simple, right? So a guy who's got no background in this can put together a $100 million transaction, add value to the marketplace, and sell it off to $1 billion company. Well, it's one of the things that's both kind of crazy and interesting and scary all at the same time. Because I remember my first meeting was at the GM building overlooking Central Park. I go around the table and it's like, Harvard MBA and Duke this and Cornell that, and I go like, well, I don't have any of those extra degrees. I said, but I did go to Ryder, and it's not a trucking school. And but the great thing is they could give a damn whether I had a GED 5 minutes into my presentation, because if I could demonstrate value, they were willing to go along with it. And that's a very particular American thing. And I say that having dealt with some stuff overseas. I dealt with some guys in France, and if you aren't from a big university or from a big company, they literally don't listen to you. Like, I could tell him what I wanted, what I thought would work, and he wouldn't listen to me. Then I would talk to the guy, my friend of mine, who was the head of digital for Time Warner. He'd say the same thing. He goes, "That's a great idea. This thing you said." And I'm like, "Oh, really? It wasn't good 5 minutes ago what I said?" And if you declare bankruptcy in France, the guy's like, "No one will ever work with you ever again. If you're done. You're done. Your family's done. Nobody will talk to you." And here we take it as like a badge of honor. Like, hey, I failed, but I got back up and I tried again. So, anyways, bottom line is these kind of structures can be something that a lot of people don't understand. You hear about private equity firms and investment banks and putting together all these deals and then putting people out of work and where's the value created. I'm going to stop there because I feel like I've said a lot, and I want to give enough time for a commentary. But this is kind of this point I wanted to be able to kind of introduce how somebody like myself went from just kind of guy looking to take risk and see where opportunity led him, and now looking at deals where, you know, our goal is to execute this transaction at about a $60 to $70 million acquisition cost, add about $150 million in revenue, and exit for somewhere between, you know, $2 and $250 million. And you're thinking, well, that's just absolutely nuts, and it will be great if it works out. But anyway, so I'll stop there and either let you guys ask questions, or if you want to jump in with commentary, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll just throw a few thoughts out there, and hopefully, some of you probably already have some questions of your own, and hopefully my thoughts may stimulate a few others. You know, in general, I'm a free market guy, and although private equity, you know, got a bad name during the last presidential election, obviously a lot of good is done, and I can't disagree with the role that risk takes. I also, I think, you know, agree from a law and economics perspective in the idea, right, that in laws, it should, at least in part, create economic efficiency, should facilitate transactions, facilitate the marketplace, and absolutely, you can't create capital grow an economy without risk. So I'm in agreement with all those things. But as a social scientist, the social scientist side of me is not very ideological, right? I think you still have to ask questions. What does this mean? And so a few questions sort of come to my mind, right? First of all, we talk about bankruptcy and the idea that, you know, it's good to have to solve that because you want people to take risks. But not all risks are created equally, are they? In other words, you know, Sean O'Hare strikes me as someone, I mean, of course you're going to fail, but you take calculated risks, and then you bring in a partner for this really big deal who evaluates the downside. So I think we have to be cautious when we think about the role of law facilitating the marketplace, and in this case, kind of just simply, you know, saying, well, the upside of bankruptcy law is it helps facilitate risk, but it also may help facilitate foolish risk. And it does seem to me that in society we know what that, right? There's some balance. Now, how you achieve that, I think, is difficult, because probably this is a federal society gathering, and I suspect most of you don't want the government deciding what foolish risk is or isn't. And yet you need a system, I think, to try to not reward utterly foolish risk, because that would probably have some downside. So I think that might be something to think about, particularly as you move through law school issues. You know, second of all, I would say we want economic efficiencies through risk-taking, right? But we do have a lot of examples of, you know, of the kind of acquisitions and buyouts that have costs to them. And I'm not necessarily saying that those costs outweigh the benefits that Sean just would have discussed, but I think you have to consider them, again, just objectively step back. And if you have an acquisition that results in downsizing or ultimately closing a company, and of course we had some famous examples during the presidential election, there are other costs, right? I mean, there are, of course, human costs involved, and they're not insignificant. It doesn't, of course, you know, businesses fail. Not everybody has a natural right to have a job working for somebody else. We may think we have a natural right to be an entrepreneur and try to create a business. And of course, human costs are always difficult to assess, but there also are economic costs, right? There are economic costs to society because if you create, you know, people lose jobs in these instances, then of course the employment rate, you know, goes up. So there may be some costs to consider. And then finally, I would just raise this from kind of a free market perspective. It's kind of funny to think about this idea of, okay, we can put two companies together and create some efficiencies, and that makes sense. Sometimes the mergers work, but the goal is, of course, to sell to one of these really large companies who just want market share. On the one hand, the act of first of all, bringing smaller companies together, again, strikes me as a positive kind of for economic growth. And you could sort of say, okay, emerging companies becoming, large companies have economies of scale, right? I mean, we can afford to buy a car because we don't want, 10,000 car makers in the country, because cars would be really expensive. Cars are affordable because we can mass produce them. So I get the economic upside, but then there's a downside, at least from a capitalistic free market perspective, and that is you reduce competition, right? Now, for the individual investor, I think that obviously that's less concerned because they're trying to put a deal together. But I think as we think about these kinds of activities in our economy, it is important to recognize that there are multiple kinds of consequences out there. And again, this is a political scientist in me. I'm thinking from a macro kind of perspective and more of a macroeconomic than a microeconomic perspective. And sometimes those things do clash, and even for people who believe in the free market. So I would throw those ideas out there. I don't think they're a disagreement at all, and that's certainly not intended to denigrate venture capital and private equity and these kinds of acquisitions. But I do think they raise these kinds of questions and they ought to at least consider.
Actually, now, we've got about 10 minutes before I know some of you have class, so particularly if there's anyone else with questions, we can address those now. Anybody? Go ahead.
Have you ever been personally involved with incorporating a business?
Incorporating one?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, multiple times. You're talking about just kind of the regulatory process of is this on? Yeah. Wow. I just had a really booming voice. Well, maybe I should tone it down. Well, I guess what do you mean by that? Because in every business I started, it was almost all of them were S corps. Just because they're pass-through entities, they're very simple to set up. I guess we have a couple of LLCs, especially for the real estate projects. Never had a reason to do a type C because we didn't see ourselves going public on any of these deals. And I think I had a sole proprietorship on my first painting company, and then very quickly realized that was a bad idea because of the exposure. But I mean, anything specific you're curious about?
Just incorporating, filing your incorporation paperwork with the state and federal government, some of the challenges you see with that, and some of the efficiencies that you
I think that part of it is pretty easy. I mean, everything I've ever done has been within 30 days. I don't know that I've ever had a problem. I mean, I've incorporated in Virginia and Delaware, the only two states I've done it in. And I did it I always just used my accountant, who also had a lawyer on staff. And so I would just send him, hey, this is what I want. He'd check to make sure the name was available. And then he'd file the paperwork and we'd be off and running. He'd send it all to me within 30 days. I'd send in, I don't know, $300 or something. And we went off and running. So that on that, in terms of getting it started, is not too difficult as far as my experience.
It's funny, I filed a lot of, I've actually owned a business as well, and we were incorporated, but it's not, I don't know if maybe in this law school you actually see the forms, but traditionally using the Socratic method, you could take a class in corporate law and pass the bar section of corporate law. I've never have seen an incorporation form, which is funny because as an attorney, if you want to practice corporate law, you'll do a hell of a lot of that.
Other question?
What kind of value are you looking to add when you combine all these companies? I think what venture capitalists get a bad rap is where it's perceived that you're just putting a bundle of things together and not really creating any value, and yet walking away with a bundle of money and getting it from the people who probably should have something.
Yeah. So I should make a distinction too between, this is just good for definitions. I've noticed that in these conversations, you don't yet have an opportunity to really distinguish between, okay, what's an investment banker, what's a private equity firm, what's a venture capitalist. So venture capital, I'll look at it in terms of the risk profile. So starting from the kind of founders, then the next level up in terms of the earliest risk is usually an angel investor, right? So it's friends, family, or an actual angel network. The next is a structured kind of venture capitalist where they usually are taking a large percentage of the company in exchange for pretty substantial risk, because at that point it's still concept. It's kind of like, you guys ever see The Social Network? It's like when Peter Thiel put in money into Mark Zuckerberg's company that was, was still early stage. There's no revenue to speak of. He put in $500,000, which, probably the best deal in human history to get $500,000 for and to get 10% of Facebook. I happen to know Peter. He's a weird guy, but good friend. So then the next stage is, and VCs, there are a lot of Silicon Valley guys. That's where you think of VCs. Then the next